Hello and welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Andrew. We're on location at Waterloo Farm Museum in Waterloo, Michigan. It's a beautiful fall day here and a perfect opportunity for us to continue Arms and Uniforms. This is our series where we take the opportunity to explore the history of the regiment through their arms and equipment and uniforms and look at how the changes in those affected their service during the war. Before we get going, I want to say thank you to the Civil War Digital Digest coffee grinders. Their financial contributions on Patreon are what allow us to put on this program. Thank you so much. If you're not already a member, consider joining. You can see the link below. Since we began doing Arms and Uniforms, the most suggested unit by the public has been Berdan's Sharpshooters. The 1st and 2nd United States Sharpshooters has served in the Army of the Potomac from 1861 to 1865, and we are finally bringing that to you today. These two regiments filled an important niche in Civil War combat. They were the light infantry of the Army of the Potomac, specialized regiments that served out in front. We talked about another regiment like this when we talked about the Pennsylvania Bucktails, but no regiments had the place in history of Berdan's Sharpshooters. These regiments were raised by Hiram Berdan, a New York City inventor who decided to put together a select group of marksmen. What's unique about these units in the Union Army is that they were raised across multiple states. Companies were raised in New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, New Hampshire, Michigan. They came from all across the North into 18 companies between the two regiments as he started to put them together. Berdan wanted the best sharpshooters for the unit, and he put men through a firing course to qualify for the regiment. They had to be able to put a certain number of rounds through the bullseye at 200 yards. And therefore, he was able to get some of the best sharpshooters throughout the North into this unit. Because of the specialized unit that Berdan put together, he wanted to get specialized equipment. And here we see a sharpshooter from the 1st or 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters in the winter of 1861. And it reflects the specialized equipment Berdan had gotten and some of the areas where he had come up short in the initial part of the unit. By the time of the American Civil War, uniforms had become far less ornate. Lace and gilt and gorgets and all these pieces of European uniforms that are carryovers from earlier eras had died out. But even still, they weren't well adapted to camouflaging soldiers. And the uniform that Berdan chose for his men was something that actually meant to be useful in the field. With this soldier here, you can see he's wearing a distinctive green frock coat. Green has a long history going back to Europe of being associated with hunters and rifle regiments. The German Jägers, which was short for hunters, were gamekeepers that had served during the American Revolution and the wars of the 18th century. In the British Army, the 95th Rifles and the 60th Rifles had served during the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. These were specialized rifle troops, armed with rifles, not muskets, and they wore rifle green uniforms. Berdan wanted to continue this tradition, and he wanted rifle green uniforms for his troops. And you can see here that the frock coat is just a take on a standard issue U.S. infantry frock coat. However, they were imported by Martin and Brothers of New York from the United Kingdom, where they used actual British Army rifle cloth with brass buttons. Subsequent issues of these coats were achieved by taking blue wool and over-dyeing them with other colors to achieve the same color. So there's some differences between later war frocks of Berdan's and the initial issue of frocks that we see. Later in this war, we see a change over to hard rubber buttons, which is a great advantage. The brass buttons you see early in the war stood out. Men either darkened their buttons in some way or replaced them with a off-color button, but later the Army issued hard rubber buttons with the infantry crest on it in order to not glint and provide a better target for the men. But you can see here that the early regiment had the frock coat, they had the hat, but a lot of troops, even though some had green trousers, most had light blue during this period. It wasn't till the beginning of 1862, in the summer of 62, that large amounts of the regiment started to get green trousers. The rest of the equipment reflects some pretty unique things. The pack that you see here is from Tiffany & Company in New York, and they provided a fur-covered pack that is very in keeping with European styles, especially the rifle regiments over there. It's kind of a throwback to the things you see from like the American Revolution. On it as well, you can see it has a tin mess kit that was specific for Berdan and his men. This kind of style is very British in its appearance. In the American Civil War, these were just not issued to regular troops in the Federal Army. This allows soldiers to have a bowl, allows them to cook in something, allows them to get several different kinds of food all at once in something that can be put together and carried with them. And unlike a lot of the standard US 1855 double bag, it lacks the chest strap, but it straps into the belt itself, which distributes the load across the soldier's belt and makes it into an equipment system instead of just having a knapsack by itself, putting the weight on the soldier's back. Now it's distributing it to his chest, to his waist. It's trying to make the load ride better. Some of the other things here are pretty standard for Federal gear. You see an 1858 smooth side canteen, you see a haversack, you see a model 1839 cartridge box. Same with the cap pouch. You would have either seen a model 1850 shield front or one of the 1861 cap pouches. But what you don't see here is a weapon. One of the areas that caused the most friction for this regiment was the weapon. Berdan had told his men, had promised his men the Sharps rifle. The model 1859 Sharps infantry rifle was a superb light infantry weapon, a highly accurate breech-loading weapon that a soldier could hit targets at long distance from. It was ideal for someone to load while kneeling or laying down. But the problem was the Ordnance Department did not want to equip Berdan's men with this weapon. So Berdan and the Ordnance Department are at impasse, and the only way that Berdan was able to get around that was actually getting the intercession of President Lincoln himself. He invited Lincoln to the camp of the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters. He saw 2 of the companies do a target shooting competition. It was only after that that Lincoln was personally able to intercede with the Ordnance Department and fulfill Berdan's promise to his troops. Consequently, an order was put in for 2,000 specially made Sharps rifles that were double-set triggers. These weapons are unique in that the 2 triggers, one allows the weapon to be set, and which makes it into a hair trigger, and then the other trigger fires it. This allows specially accurate shooting, so the shooter could get into position, get on target, set the trigger, and with a very fine trigger pressure, able to shoot. This means that the weapon wouldn't jump as much while pulling the trigger, leading to more accurate shooting. However, because of how late the order for this got put in, Berdan's men were largely without weapons in the fall of 1861. In the interim, Berdan's men were supposed to be armed with the Colt revolving rifle. It's a 5-shot, 52 caliber breech-loading weapon, built on the same principles as Colt's revolving pistol. However, it had some limitations. It was notorious for chain firing, which means all cylinders would fire at once, which means that it's not great for a soldier's left hand resting on the forestock. It also just wasn't as accurate a weapon, it wasn't as reliable a weapon, and the men were largely unsatisfied from it and refused to be armed with it. The men Berdan recruited were sharpshooters, and they expected a weapon commensurate with their skills. Many sharpshooters in the civilian world use a target rifle, a bulky, heavy rifle with a very thick barrel. It was excellent for target shooting, but these men were not just sharpshooters. They weren't snipers in the modern sense. They didn't want a setup that could go to 1,000 yards or anything like that. They wanted a weapon that was very accurate, but also light and could be used in the field, and were excellent for their role as light infantry. In the meantime, Berdan did get 100 Hall's breech-loading rifles made available to him, but these were antiquated weapons by the time of the Civil War. They're from 1819. They were breech-loading weapons. However, they had been worn out over time, and they were used as guard weapons for the men. They would rotate through them, and one of the reasons we have this soldier here shown without a bayonet and scabbard is because of the nature of the weapons for the regiment during this period. When the men finally got to Yorktown in 1862, they still were unarmed. And so you have this regiment, the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters, now with the 5th Corps in the field, and this regiment of fine marksmen have no weapons. And only then did they finally accept the Colt revolving rifles, which they carried in the early part of the Peninsula Campaign. 2 of the items that we don't have here on the model, but we have images for you, are the Whipple patent cap and the seamless patent overcoat. These were items issued to the men as well early in their time. The overcoat in particular was an issue for the troops. While it was very cool for them, it was gray, so that made it unique. It stood out in the Army of the Potomac because the men there, overcoats were light blue. It was something that they talk about while in the trenches at Yorktown, that the Confederates very soon started to realize that the Berdan's men were wearing this overcoat. Part of the thing with sharpshooters is the idea is this is to blend in. One of the problems the Berdans suffered throughout their service is their unique items actually made them stand out. So while they may camouflage into the environment, when they were seen, it was very easy to tell who they were because of the uniform items. The overcoat was probably the first one that made them stand out. The last item that we're not showing here are some of the flourishes. There was brown leather leggings that men were issued early in the war and wore throughout 1861, 1862. And early on in their service, men like to flourish out their cap. There's lots of pictures of men with plumes in their caps.
For tendage at this point in the war, the sharpshooters used one of two options, the Sibley tent and the common tent.
Both of these are the tents that you see soldiers being issued in 1861. They're excellent tents for fixed locations. So for a winter camp, that would have been wonderful tendage for the men. However, going into the campaign season, these tents are bulky. They have to be carried by wagon trains, which greatly increase the logistics footprint in the Army, and they really became unpractical. And you'll see that these tents don't last long into the war. So this is how Berdan's men would have looked on the way to the peninsula in early 1862. So now let's move forward a couple months and see how Berdan's men would have looked after a few months of hard campaigning later that summer. By the fall of 1862, the sharpshooters, along with the whole Army of the Potomac, was worn out and tired. They'd gone through an arduous series of campaigns with the Second Bull Run campaign, retreating back into the DC area, and immediately going out on the Maryland campaign. And here we see a soldier from the 2nd United States Sharpshooters during the Antietam campaign. The 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters was part of the 1st Corps at this time. The 1st Sharpshooters were still part of the 5th Corps. The two regiments were separated. They fought on their own at this point, but they were very similarly equipped. The initial issue of both regiments had largely started to expire at this point. A lot of their original gear had been lost, clothing had worn out, and so the soldier you see here is a much more campaign-wise soldier, a veteran, than what we showed earlier with that early 1862 look. The biggest change for this soldier is his weapon. Now, it's important to specify that Berdan's sharpshooters, while they had marksmanship requirements, and we hear the word sharpshooter, we think sniper. But it's really important to remember that these are light infantry men. Their role is not to be expert shots. That's, of course, part of it. But again, not sniper, but think more skirmishers, think ranger, think about men who are doing advance guards, rear guards, pickets, flanking, all of the role of light infantrymen, not just the target shooting. So Berdan wanted a rifle that was good for all of those functions. And the Sharps infantry rifle turned out to be an amazing weapon. Not only is it rugged, but it's dependable. It's highly accurate, even at long to medium range. 500 yards plus, the Sharps rifle still delivers accurate fire. One of the other advantages of this rifle is its breech loading. It's easy for a soldier to lay down, work the breech, feed in ammunition, and fire from a prone position, from behind cover. This lets the soldier maximize his cover, maximize his protection. It also meant for a high rate of fire. Whereas the Colt revolving rifle lets you fire those few rounds in the cylinder quickly, loading it was a long, arduous process, and anyone who's loaded a cap and ball revolver will understand it's not an easy thing to do under combat conditions. The Sharps, on the other hand, lets a soldier feed those rounds quickly and allows them to maintain a constant rate of fire instead of spurts of fire with long reloading periods. Just as a note that can be a little confusing, the Sharps rifle is named after its inventor, Christian Sharps. It has nothing to do with the term sharpshooter, which had been in long service with the American military prior to this point. The other things about this uniform, you see a soldier who's been on campaign. He's wearing regular Model 1851 sky blue infantry trousers, the type adopted at the beginning of the Civil War. And you can see here they're distressed. They show long time on campaign. They're worn out. They've got tears in them. You can see that calfskin knapsack is gone. It is now being replaced by a blanket roll, something that's lighter, easier to carry on campaign. It also reflects knapsacks were something that soldiers oftentimes lost on a battlefield. You can see he also still has a gum blanket inside the rear of his belt. The gum blanket was one of the indispensable pieces of gear for the soldier. All the rest of his possessions he had with him would have been bundled up inside the blanket roll, spare shirts, socks, any personal items like a housewife or anything like that. Anything else would have been put in his pockets, inside the coat, or inside a haversack along with his food items. The rest of the gear that we have here is the standard gear. It's the same kind of gear we saw in the earlier look. It's still the 1850s, 60s style leather gear, still have a smooth side canteen. You're still seeing the model 1851 haversack. Again, these soldiers are drawing from the normal quartermaster supplies that the rest of the army is drawing from. The difference, though, is the box is now a Sharps box, specific for this weapon. It's optimized for the ammo size of the Sharps. The other thing that's worth noting with the Sharps rifle is the ammunition is different with it. It's a fixed ammunition, which means that when you open the box, there's no tearing open of a cartridge, pouring powder, or anything like that. It's a bullet with either linen or nitrated paper. It's fed into the breech, and when the hammer hits the cap, it goes down the channel and sets off the round from there. It's a different way to issue ammo. It's unique to this weapon, and it's one of the things that made it more efficient. Now, by this point in the war, Berdan sharpshooters would have been using the shelter half, the dog tent, that became ubiquitous in the Army of the Potomac in the spring and summer of 1862. This tent was great. Two soldiers would have come together, bundled together to make one complete tent. It was something small, easily carried by a soldier, and adaptable. It replaced the earlier tents that we talked about that were bulky and had to be carried by the wagon trains. It freed up baggage in the army and meant that the soldier could have his tentage with them no matter where the wagon trains were. By the fall of 1862, Berdan's men are veterans. They've gone through a year of hard campaigning. They've lost a lot of their unique items, but they have gained their most iconic piece of equipment, the Sharps rifle that is forever tied with them. So now let's look to see how they appeared going into the spring of 1863. By early 1863, the two regiments of Berdan sharpshooters were finally brigaded together in the 3rd Brigade of the 3rd Division of the 3rd Corps, and Hiram Berdan finally could exercise direct control over both of his regiments. And coming out of winter quarters, this is how we would have seen the 1st and 2nd U.S. sharpshooters looking. You can see that the soldier here is reflecting a reissue of a lot of the original equipment, a complete reissue of the coat, the trousers, the hat, with the addition now of the Corps badge. As the 3rd Division of the 3rd Corps, you see a blue losange on there, which would have been their Corps badge as instituted in March 1863 in the Army of the Potomac. The weapon remains the same. We're still seeing that Sharps rifle that we're going to see for the rest of the war. But a lot of the other equipment is, again, just becoming more and more generic Federal. Now we see the Model 1855 double-bag knapsack. The ubiquitous Federal knapsack is what the Berdans are issued. Their unique knapsack we saw in 1861, 1862 has gone away. It's easier to replace this knapsack than anything else. The rest of the equipment is remaining the same. Still standard issue Federal equipment, the Sharps box, still the canteen haversack that we would have seen of any soldier. And going into the 1863 campaign, together as this rifle brigade, this is how Berdan's men would have looked. This is how particularly they would have looked at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863. One of the other things I want you to notice is the breastplate on the cartridge box belt has disappeared. So that cross belt, while it was standard Federal issue, is a large piece of brass. We talked earlier about they had blackened buttons. Well, why do you have this large piece of brass right in the middle of a chest for a soldier? Things like that started to get dropped by soldiers in Berdans, and so we chose to show them here without that, as you can see from photos of original soldiers. And again, you're seeing now these veteran soldiers are making choices about their equipment that reflect their experience through a year of combat. So this is how Berdan's men looked at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now we're going to look forward 2 months and see how they looked at one of their most iconic battles, the Battle of Gettysburg. There were a lot of changes in how the Berdan sharpshooters looked just 2 months after the Battle of Chancellorsville going into the Gettysburg campaign. The Army of the Potomac went back into their winter quarters after the Chancellorsville campaign, and they had a chance to resupply. And for the sharpshooters, that was important because Chancellorsville had been hard on the regiment. Chancellorsville had been a hard campaign for these regiments. They had lost their knapsacks outside of Chancellorsville, and they had to get them resupplied. It also was a chance for the men to make some choices about their clothing going into the summer campaign. a lot of the men put their frock coats into storage, as well as their overcoats. We talked earlier about the gray overcoats the regiment had initially been issued. By this point of the war, they had been using the standard sky blue footman's greatcoat that the rest of the army used. But going in the summer campaign, they didn't need that, so it went into storage. Same with the frock coat. As you can see here, the soldiers wearing the sack coat, the fatigue blouse that was ubiquitous throughout the Army of the Potomac. It made him stand out less. Not only is it looser, lighter, it was easier for a soldier to move around in, it also was something that made the regiments be less of a showcase in the Army. We talked earlier about this balance of they had this uniform that optimized camouflage. Well, as the war went on, they let their skills on the battlefield designate them more than their uniform themselves. They more and more just blended in with the Army. One of the other big changes is that you can see the soldier doesn't have a bayonet scabbard anymore. These soldiers, by and large, started dropping them by this point in the war. And it was because they didn't really see the need for bayonet. They were elite light infantry, and they weren't being used for hand-to-hand combat. They were skirmishers. They weren't out there doing bayonet assaults, and so a lot of the men decided not to have them anymore. You can still see the soldier has on his blue diamond. The 3rd Division, 3rd Corps was broken up after Chancellorsville. And the 3rd Corps, there were a lot of regiments that were mustered out and sent home. And these 2 regiments ended up in the 1st Division, 3rd Corps. However, we know that those soldiers weren't issued the new Corps badges until after Gettysburg. So at Gettysburg, they either would have had the blue Corps badges or they would have had no Corps badges. And there's a good reason to believe that the soldiers may have still kept their blue diamonds as a mark of pride in the idea that they were then this rifle brigade, the Sharpshooter Brigade in 1863. They had a lot of pride in that, and it makes sense they would have carried it up until they had been forced to change to the red diamonds following Gettysburg. Beyond that, this is still the standard gear that we see, that we've talked about up until this point. Standard issue federal blanket, gun blanket, knapsack, all the rest of the accoutrements. Of course, being updated, being reissued, and there's small changes throughout the war in what exactly is being issued, but by and large, it's matching what we see in the rest of the Federal Army. So this is how the regiments would have looked going into Gettysburg, which for Berdan's sharpshooters was one of their high moments in the war. They were extremely active there. They played a prominent role in the battle, and they were well noted for their actions there. Now moving forward into the summer of 1864, it's the end times of the regiment, and we're going to see how they looked as the regiments were fading away in the trenches at Petersburg. By the summer of 1864, the sharpshooters had undergone a great deal of change. By this point in the war, they're in the trenches outside Petersburg, and they're also no longer in the 3rd Corps, they're in the 2nd Corps. And this change of service reflects what we see here in this last look in the sharpshooters. The biggest thing that you see is overall the look isn't that much different than what we see at Gettysburg. We see mixes of sharpshooter gear along with a lot of federal issue gear, but here we see a prevalence of the Army issue hat, the Hardee hat. And we see a lot of accounts of the soldiers talking about being in the trenches at Petersburg and wanting a hat, a broad-brimmed hat to cover them. The summer of 1864, it's hot. Berdan's sharpshooters are more and more being used in that sniper role rather than just as a light infantryman. It's been more out in front of the trenches, looking for targets of opportunity, and a hat was a more utilitarian piece of gear for that role. Other things you see is we are still keeping the 3rd Corps badge on this soldier.
When the 3rd Corps and the 1st Corps were dissolved in March 1864, the men were allowed to retain their Corps badges.
And even though the Berdan sharpshooters were transferred over to the 3rd Division, 2nd Corps, they were allowed to keep their red diamonds, and they widely did so. By that point, it was a mark of pride. The soldiers had spent a great deal of time in this division, and they wanted to hang on to it. One of the other things you see here is the belt has changed. The standard issue U.S. belt dropped its leather keeper sometime about the spring of 1864, and instead was substituted a brass keeper. And we're showing that here in the enlisted belt of the soldier. Otherwise, there's not a great deal of change. He's still using that trusty Sharps rifle, and the rest of his equipment reflects standard issue federal equipment by this point in the war. Pretty much all the marks of the sharpshooters we saw early in the war have disappeared from his equipment. Instead, he's using things that would be easily available through the quartermaster stores. So this is how the sharpshooters ended their service, looking more and more like a generic federal soldier. distinguished by their weapon and their skills, and less by their appearance on the battlefield. Unfortunately for Berdan's sharpshooters, their service at the end of the war, they slowly dissolved away. As different companies' terms of service expired, men were either folded into different companies, and eventually the first sharpshooters were disbanded, the men folded into the second, and over time the second sharpshooters similarly dissolved away. The men were sent away to regiments from their home states, and the second and first U.S. sharpshooters disappeared from the Army rolls. Arms and Uniforms is about looking at how a regiment's uniforms and equipment and armament changed throughout the war based on their service. And few regiments show it as well as Berdan's sharpshooters. I hope you've enjoyed this look into their service and their equipment. And for Civil War Digital Digest, I'm Andrew. We'll catch you next time.